June 19, 1944. Admiral Matome Ugaki stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, field glasses pressed against his eyes, scanning the western horizon. The largest carrier battle in history was unfolding before him, and in the span of the next 6 hours, he would witness something that would shatter every assumption Japanese naval command had held about winning this war. Through the haze of anti-aircraft fire and burning aircraft, Ugaki counted them. American carriers. Not 3 or 4 as intelligence had suggested, not even the 6 or 7 that seemed plausible. 15 American carriers were operating in coordinated task groups, launching wave after wave of aircraft with mechanical precision. His diary that evening would record a single devastating observation. The war was not being lost in battles. It was being lost in American shipyards, and there was absolutely nothing Japan could do to stop it. What Ugaki was witnessing at the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not simply a tactical defeat. It was the material manifestation of a strategic miscalculation so profound that it had doomed Japan's war effort before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The Americans had built an industrial system that could produce fleet carriers faster than Japan could train the pilots to oppose them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Matome Ugaki was not a romantic, he was a calculator. Born in 1890 in rural Okayama Prefecture, he had entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1909 and graduated 9th in a class of 144 cadets. His career had been built on precision, on understanding the mathematics of naval warfare, on calculating tonnage and fuel consumption and range. By 1941, he had risen to become Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His role was specific. When Yamamoto proposed an operation, Ugaki's job was to calculate whether it would work. Not whether it should work philosophically, not whether it aligned with Bushido spirit, but whether the numbers added up. And in late 1941, Ugaki had run the numbers on Japan's carrier strength. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 fleet carriers. The Americans had 7 split between 2 oceans. Japan held numerical superiority in the Pacific. The plan was to strike Pearl Harbor, eliminate American carrier strength in the opening blow, then consolidate Southeast Asia during a 6-month window before American production could respond. Ugaki had calculated that window carefully. 6 months. That was how long Japan needed to secure the resources and defensive perimeter that would make the war too costly for America to continue. After 6 months, American industrial capacity would begin to matter, but by then Japan's position would be unassailable, and negotiation would follow. The calculation had one critical assumption: American carrier production would require years to replace losses. Pre-war carriers like USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise had required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Even with accelerated wartime production, Ugaki had assumed American yards would need at least 2 years to produce new fleet carriers. This assumption was not pulled from thin air. It was based on Japan's own experience. Japanese shipyards, among the finest in the world, required 18 to 24 months to produce a fleet carrier under optimal conditions. The idea that American yards could work faster than Japanese yards seemed to violate everything Ugaki understood about precision shipbuilding. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack proceeded exactly as planned. 8 American battleships were sunk or severely damaged. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japanese losses were minimal. The tactical victory was absolute. For a brief moment, Ugaki's calculation seemed validated, but something was happening that Ugaki had not anticipated, something that was not part of any calculation. In American shipyards, from Newport News to Philadelphia to New York, a different kind of mobilization was underway. The Essex-Class carrier program had begun in July 1940 before Pearl Harbor. 3 hulls had been laid down by December 7th. Orders for 10 more were placed before January 1942, but these were not the slow, methodical construction projects that Japanese planners understood. American shipyards were about to demonstrate something that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of the Pacific War. USS Essex herself was laid down on April 28, 1941 at Newport News Shipbuilding. After Pearl Harbor, her construction contract was reworked and accelerated. She was launched on July 31, 1942. She was commissioned on December 31, 1942. Total construction time, 20 months. This was already faster than Japanese yards could manage, but it was just the beginning. USS Yorktown, the second Essex-Class carrier, was laid down on December 1, 1941. She was commissioned on April 15, 1943. Construction time, 16.5 months. USS Franklin, built at the same Newport News yard as Essex, was laid down in December 1942 and commissioned in January 1944. Construction time, 14 months. 14 months. From keel to operational carrier in 14 months. This was a construction rate that Japanese planners had considered physically impossible. Quality shipbuilding required time, precision, careful craftsmanship. You could not rush such things without producing inferior vessels, yet the Americans were doing exactly that, and the ships were not inferior. They were superb. What Ugaki did not understand in early 1943 was that American shipyards had fundamentally reimagined the carrier construction process. Instead of treating each ship as a unique craft project, American yards had implemented mass production techniques. Components were standardized, sections were prefabricated, assembly processes were streamlined. Workers who had never built ships before Pearl Harbor were trained in weeks to perform specialized tasks with remarkable precision. By August 1943, the first Essex-class carriers reached Pearl Harbor. USS Essex and USS Yorktown arrived within days of each other. They were followed in the same month by USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill, and the light carriers USS Independence and USS Princeton. In a single month, 5 new American carriers became operational in the Pacific. Ugaki received the intelligence reports in late 1943. The numbers did not make sense. American carrier strength in the Pacific had increased from 3 operational carriers in June 1942 to 9 by December 1943, and the intelligence suggested more were coming, many more. He began making new calculations. If the Americans could produce carriers at this rate, and if the rate was accelerating, then Japan's 6-month window was not simply closing. It had never actually existed. Every month the war continued, American numerical superiority would increase. Japan had no industrial answer to this production rate. None. By January 1944, Ugaki had access to more comprehensive intelligence. The picture it painted was devastating. The United States had not simply built a few new carriers. They had created an entirely new class of carriers and were producing them on an industrial scale. 17 Essex-class carriers were under construction or already commissioned. More were being ordered. But it was not just the carriers themselves. Each Essex-class carrier required a screen of destroyers and cruisers for protection. It required a logistical train of oilers and supply ships to sustain operations. It required trained pilots, maintenance crews, ordnance specialists. The Americans were producing all of this simultaneously. Ugaki compared this to Japan's situation. Since Pearl Harbor, Japan had commissioned exactly 3 fleet carriers. All 3 had been laid down before the war began. IJN Junyo and IJN Hio were conversions from ocean liners, not purpose-built fleet carriers. IJN Taiho was Japan's only true new fleet carrier design, and she had required 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. Japan's shipyards were now fully occupied with repairs and maintenance. The carrier, IJN Shokaku, had been damaged twice in 1942 and spent 31 weeks in dry dock. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to simultaneously repair damaged ships, maintain operational vessels, and construct new carriers at scale. More critically, Japan lacked the escorts. Each carrier required multiple destroyers and cruisers as protection. By late 1943, Japanese destroyer losses in the Solomons campaign had reduced the destroyer fleet to 46% of its December 19, 41 strength. There were not enough escorts to screen the carriers Japan already possessed, let alone new construction. And then there was the pilot problem. Training a competent carrier pilot required hundreds of hours of flight time. Before the war, Japanese naval pilots trained for 700 hours or more. American pilots in December 1941 trained for approximately 300 hours, but by 1943, the situation had reversed. American pilot training programs had expanded dramatically. New pilots were receiving 600 to 800 hours of training before deployment. They trained over friendly territory with ample fuel supplies and modern aircraft. The training pipeline was producing more pilots than were being lost in combat. Japan's pilot training program had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant training flights were limited. Combat losses were exceeding replacement rates. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots were being deployed with as few as 40 to 70 hours of training. They were being sent into combat against American pilots with 10 times their experience, flying aircraft with superior performance characteristics. Ugaki understood what this meant. Even if Japan could somehow match American carrier production, which it could not, Japan lacked the pilots to operate them effectively. The mathematics were absolute. The war was no longer winnable through any conventional calculation. April 18, 1943. Ugaki's calculation framework was shattered in the most personal way possible. He and Admiral Yamamoto were traveling in separate Mitsubishi bombers over Bougainville when American P-38 fighters intercepted them. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. He was killed instantly. Ugaki's plane crashed into the sea at high speed. He was one of 3 survivors, seriously injured, evacuated to a hospital. As Ugaki recovered from his injuries through May and June 1943, he had time to process what the intelligence reports were saying. The Americans were not simply producing more carriers, they were producing carriers faster than Japan could respond to their deployment. The Essex-Class program alone would deliver more carriers in 2 years than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. By the time Ugaki returned to active duty, taking command of the 1st Battleship Division in August 1943, the strategic situation had deteriorated further. The Americans had secured Guadalcanal. They were advancing through the Central Pacific, and with each advance came more carriers, new carriers, fresh crews, overwhelming air power. Ugaki's battleship division included the Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. They had been built on the assumption that their massive firepower would be decisive in the battleship versus battleship engagements that traditional naval warfare theory predicted. But carrier warfare had rendered this assumption obsolete. These magnificent battleships existed primarily to screen carriers from air attack, a defensive role for which they were grotesquely overbuilt. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, Ugaki watched the intelligence reports with growing dread. Every month brought news of another American carrier commissioning: USS Intrepid in August, USS Hornet in November, USS Wasp in November, USS Hancock in April 1944, USS Ticonderoga in May. The names kept coming. And it was not just fleet carriers. The Americans had also commissioned 9 Independence-class light carriers in 1943. These were smaller, faster conversions from cruiser hulls, carrying fewer aircraft but adding flexibility to task force operations. Japan had attempted similar conversions with the carriers Chitose and Chiyoda, but the scale was incomparable. 2 Japanese conversions versus 9 American conversions, all completed in a single year, May 19, 1944. Ugaki's battleship division was ordered to prepare for a major operation. American forces had landed on Biak Island. Admiral Toyoda, now commanding the combined fleet, saw this as an opportunity to engage American carrier forces in the long-awaited decisive battle. The operation was called Conforce. Ugaki argued forcefully that Japan had a strategic imperative to hold Biak. The island controlled key sea lanes, But more fundamentally, Ugaki recognized that Japan's window for a decisive naval engagement was rapidly closing. Every month that passed saw more American carriers arrive in theater. If there was to be a battle that could alter the trajectory of the war, it had to happen soon. But on June 12, 1944, the operation was postponed. American forces had begun bombarding Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to begin. Ugaki's battleships joined the mobile force, deploying for the defense of the Marianas. The Japanese plan was built around a calculated advantage. American carriers would be operating near Saipan, tied to protecting the invasion force. Japanese carriers could operate from longer range, using land-based aircraft from Philippine and Marianas airfields to supplement their carrier air groups. On paper, this force multiplication should have compensated for American numerical superiority, but the plan depended on assumptions that were no longer valid. Japanese intelligence suggested the Americans would have perhaps 8 to 10 carriers in the area. The actual number was 15. Task Force 58, under Admiral Matome, had assembled the largest concentration of carrier power ever deployed. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers, over 900 aircraft. Against this, Admiral Ozawa's mobile force had 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers, approximately 450 aircraft. The Japanese were outnumbered 2 to 1 in carriers, 2 to 1 in aircraft, and critically, the quality gap had widened dramatically. June 19, 1944, 0630 hours. Ugaki was on the bridge of Yamato as dawn broke over the Philippine Sea. Japanese search planes reported American carrier forces approximately 300 miles to the east. Ozawa made the decision to attack. Beginning at 0830, the Japanese launched 4 consecutive airstrikes, totaling 373 aircraft. Ugaki watched through field glasses as the first wave launched. He knew the pilots. Many had fewer than 100 hours of training. They were flying into battle against American pilots with 800 hours or more. They were flying aircraft that lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and adequate armor. And they were flying toward the most concentrated anti-aircraft firepower ever assembled at sea. What happened next would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The first Japanese strike of 69 aircraft was detected by American radar at over 100 miles. F-6F Hellcat fighters were launched to intercept long before the Japanese reached the carrier screen. The Hellcat was a revelation. It combined superior speed, armor protection, and firepower with the ruggedness to absorb battle damage. Against the aging A-6M0, which remained Japan's primary carrier fighter, the Hellcat held every advantage. But the decisive factor was not the aircraft. It was the pilots. American fighter pilots had been trained extensively in the Thatch weave and other mutual support tactics. They fought as coordinated teams, using radio communication to vector reinforcements to threatened areas. Japanese pilots, many seeing their first combat, fought individually using tactics that had been effective in 1942 but were now obsolete. The American defensive system was equally revolutionary. The Combat Information Center on each carrier coordinated fighter direction based on radar plots. Controllers could see the entire tactical picture and position fighters to intercept incoming raids with maximum efficiency. This integration of sensors, communications, and fighters created a layered defense that Japanese strike aircraft simply could not penetrate. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, 42 were shot down before reaching the American carriers. Those that survived the fighter screen faced a second barrier, the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire ever deployed. The Essex-Class carriers mounted multiple quadruple 40mm and twin 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Their escort ships added hundreds more guns to the defensive screen. But the Americans possessed something else, something the Japanese could not match and had not fully anticipated. The proximity fuse. This top-secret weapon used a miniature radar in each anti-aircraft shell to detonate when near an aircraft, creating a sphere of shrapnel that did not require a direct hit. The effectiveness of this weapon was devastating. Japanese aircraft began exploding in mid-air from shells that appeared to miss them. The second Japanese strike launched at 0:56 with 128 aircraft. The result was identical to the first. American fighters intercepted the formation far from the carriers. 97 aircraft were shot down. Not a single American carrier was hit. The third strike of 47 aircraft launched at 10 hours. Again, American fighters intercepted and destroyed the formation. 6 aircraft survived to attempt attacks. All failed, 0 hits. The fourth strike of 82 aircraft was the most tragic. Due to navigation errors, most have never found the American fleet. Those that did were systematically destroyed by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 73 aircraft were lost. By 1500 hours, the one-sided air battle was over. The Japanese had launched 373 aircraft. Only 130 returned to their carriers. 243 aircraft had been destroyed in a single day. More critically, 243 pilots had been killed. Irreplaceable pilots, the last generation of reasonably trained Japanese naval aviators, had been annihilated. Ugaki recorded the losses in his diary that evening. His handwriting was precise despite the shock. He noted not just the tactical defeat but what it represented. The Americans had not simply won an air battle. They had demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation no longer posed a credible threat to American carrier operations. The quality gap had become so wide that Japanese pilots could not even reach their targets, let alone damage them. But the disaster was not limited to aircraft losses. While the air battle raged, American submarines had penetrated the Japanese carrier screen. USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier IJN Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armoured carrier, on her first operational deployment. USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier IJN Hio, 2 fleet carriers lost in a single day, adding to the 243 aircraft destroyed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into a second day. On June 20th, American carriers launched their own strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. They sank one more carrier, IJN Hio, and damaged several other ships. The Japanese mobile force, which had sortied with 9 carriers, limped back to Okinawa with 6 carriers so severely depleted of aircraft and pilots that they were effectively useless. Ugaki spent the night of June 20th calculating the losses. 3 fleet carriers sunk, over 600. Aircraft destroyed. Hundreds of trained pilots killed. The American losses were comparatively trivial. 123 aircraft lost, mostly to fuel exhaustion during night recoveries. 0 carriers damaged. 0 capital ships lost. The exchange ratio was approximately 6-to-1 in aircraft, infinity to 1 in carriers, but the numbers alone did not capture the full scope of the defeat. Japan had lost its last operational reserve of carrier-qualified pilots. The training pipeline could not replace them. The few remaining experienced pilots could not train new pilots fast enough. From this point forward, every Japanese carrier operation would be flown by pilots with minimal training, facing American pilots with overwhelming advantages in experience, aircraft quality, and supporting systems. Ugaki understood what Admiral Spruance had achieved. The American commander had not prioritized sinking Japanese carriers. He had prioritized destroying Japanese naval aviation. Carriers, without aircraft, were merely expensive targets. By annihilating Japan's air groups while preserving his own, Spruance had achieved something more decisive than sinking ships. He had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct carrier warfare. Throughout July and August 1944, Ugaki received regular intelligence updates on American carrier operations. The Essex-Class carriers were arriving at a rate of approximately 1 per month. USS Bennington in August, USS Bonhomme Richard in November, USS Leyte in April 1945. The production continued relentlessly. But what shocked Ugaki most was not simply the number of carriers. It was the realization of how long this production had been underway. The Americans had not begun building these carriers after Pearl Harbor in a reactive panic. They had begun in July 1940. They had anticipated the need for massive carrier expansion before the war even started. They had planned for a long war. They had built the industrial infrastructure to win a long war. Japan had planned for a short war, a 6-month window, a decisive battle, negotiations. The entire strategic framework had been built on the assumption that Japan could not win a prolonged industrial conflict with the United States. Therefore, Japan had to win quickly. The problem was that the Americans had never intended to lose quickly. They had built carrier production lines designed to operate continuously for years. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ugaki began reviewing pre-war intelligence estimates. Japanese naval planners had known that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's capacity by a significant margin. They had known this, but they had not understood the velocity. They had not understood that American factories could shift from peacetime to wartime production at speeds that Japanese industry could not match. In 1943 alone, American shipyards produced 47,836 military aircraft. Japan produced 8,861. The ratio was better than 5-1. In 1944, American production reached 85,898 aircraft. Japan produced 16,693. The gap was not closing, it was accelerating. The same pattern held for every category of war material: liberty ships, destroyers, submarines, tanks, artillery, ammunition. The Americans were producing at rates that Japanese planners had not considered physically possible, and they were sustaining these production rates month after month, year after year, while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. Ugaki compared this to Japan's situation. Japanese factories were running at maximum capacity but could not increase output. Resources were increasingly constrained. Shipping losses meant that raw materials could not reliably reach factories. Skilled workers were being drafted into military service, reducing industrial efficiency. Japan's production was declining even as American production continued to climb. The carrier disparity illustrated the problem perfectly. By June 1944, the United States Navy had 29 fleet and light carriers operational. Japan had 9. By December 1944, the Americans had increased to 32 carriers. Japan had decreased to 6. By the war's end, the ratio would be even more extreme. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Ugaki's battleship division participated in what would become the largest naval battle in history. The battle was Japan's last attempt to destroy American amphibious forces and alter the trajectory of the war. It was a desperate gamble, built on a desperate plan. The Japanese strategy used the remaining carriers as bait. The carriers, now with virtually no aircraft aboard, would lure American carrier forces away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships, including Yamato, would strike the vulnerable amphibious forces. The plan assumed American commanders would prioritize sinking carriers over protecting transports. Ugaki understood the implications of this strategy. Japanese carriers, which 3 years earlier had been the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled, were now considered expendable decoys. They had no other military value. Their aircraft were gone. Their pilots were dead. They existed only to draw American attention away from the real attack. The plan achieved some success. American carriers pursued the Japanese decoy force and sank all 4 carriers. But at Leyte Gulf itself, Ugaki witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His battleship division, including the mighty Yamato, encountered a group of American escort carriers and destroyers. These were not fleet carriers. These were small, slow escort carriers designed for anti-submarine patrol and supporting amphibious operations. The Japanese battleships and cruisers possessed overwhelming firepower superiority. The largest battleship in the world was firing on tiny escort carriers. The battle should have been a massacre. Instead, it became an embarrassment. The American destroyers conducted aggressive torpedo attacks that disrupted Japanese formations. The escort carriers launched their aircraft, which conducted continuous harassment attacks despite having minimal anti-ship weapons. And, critically, the American commanders executed their defense with an aggression and tactical flexibility that the Japanese could not match. Ugaki watched as the engagement devolved into chaos. The Yamato maneuvered to avoid torpedo attacks rather than prosecuting firing solutions against the carriers. Cruisers pursued damaged destroyers instead of focusing on the primary targets. Communications broke down, and after several hours of confused fighting, the order came to withdraw. The invasion force at Leyte Gulf remained intact. The mission had failed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended any illusion that Japan could win the naval war. The combined fleet had committed virtually its entire remaining strength. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships sunk, including the Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, 6 heavy cruisers sunk, thousands of sailors dead. And for what? The Americans continued their operations at Leyte without significant delay. The sacrifice had achieved nothing. November 1944, Ugaki was recalled to Japan and assigned to the Naval General Staff. In February 1945, he was appointed commander of the 5th Air Fleet, based on Kyushu. His mission was to direct the aerial defense of Japan using kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks, the last resort of a military that had exhausted all other options. Ugaki's new command included hundreds of aircraft, but very few experienced pilots. The remaining pilots had minimal training. Many had never landed on an aircraft carrier. Some had fewer than 50 hours total flight time. They were being asked to fly one-way missions against the most powerful naval force ever assembled. From his headquarters bunker on Kyushu, Ugaki planned the kamikaze operations against American forces off Okinawa, wave after wave of suicide attacks. Young pilots climbing into aircraft they barely knew how to fly, carrying bombs they would never release, aiming to crash into American ships. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. Japan could no longer compete in conventional warfare, so it had resorted to trading lives for minimal tactical gains. The kamikazes achieved some successes. Several American ships were sunk, more were damaged. But the fundamental equation remained unchanged. For every American ship damaged, dozens of Japanese aircraft and pilots were lost, and the Americans were replacing their losses while Japan could not. Essex-Class carriers hit by kamikazes were repaired within weeks and returned to operations. Japan had no such capacity. Ugaki watched the casualty reports accumulate through March, April, and May 1945. Thousands of young pilots were dead. They had died bravely. They had died following orders, but they had died for nothing. The American advance had not been stopped. It had barely been delayed. The industrial mathematics were absolute. In his diary, Ugaki wrote extensively about American carrier operations off Okinawa. At any given time, 15 to 20 American carriers were operating in the area. They maintained constant combat air patrols. They launched systematic strikes against Japanese airfields. They provided continuous close air support for ground operations. And they did this for months without interruption, because they possessed the logistical infrastructure to sustain such operations indefinitely. Japan could not sustain operations for months. Japan could barely sustain operations for weeks. Fuel was critically short. Replacement aircraft could not reach Okinawa through the American blockade. The few aircraft that did arrive were immediately thrown into kamikaze attacks because there was no fuel for extended training, no spare parts for maintenance, no time for tactical planning. July 1945. American carrier aircraft began systematic raids on Japanese home islands. They struck with impunity. Japanese air defenses were so depleted that raids proceeded without significant opposition. At Kure Naval Base, American carrier aircraft attacked the remaining Japanese carriers. IJN Amagi was sunk. IJN Katsuragi was heavily damaged. The battleships Issei and Hyuga, which had been partially converted to carry aircraft, were both sunk at their moorings on July 28. Ugaki recorded the attacks in his diary. He noted the professional efficiency of American operations, the systematic approach, the overwhelming firepower, the complete air superiority. Japan had no response, no counter, no strategy that could alter the outcome. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. The atomic bomb. Ugaki learned of the weapon through military channels. The reports were fragmentary and difficult to believe. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands. The weapon utilized atomic fission. America had developed and deployed a weapon that transcended conventional warfare entirely. August 9th. Nagasaki, a second atomic bomb. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The strategic situation had become completely untenable. Japan could not win. Japan could not negotiate. Japan could only surrender or face complete annihilation. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Ugaki listened in his headquarters bunker. The war was over. Japan had lost. Everything he had calculated in 1941 had been wrong. Every assumption had proven false. The 6-month window had never existed. The decisive battle had never been possible. The war had been unwinnable from the moment it began. After listening to the emperor's announcement, Ugaki made a final entry in his diary. He wrote that he had not yet received an official ceasefire order. He wrote that as commander of the 5th Air Fleet, he bore responsibility for the failure to stop the American advance. He wrote that he would fly one last kamikaze mission to demonstrate the true spirit of Bushido. His staff protested. The war was over. Further attacks would violate the surrender terms. They would be meaningless. But Ugaki insisted. He climbed into the rear seat of a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber. The pilot was Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatsuru. As they prepared to launch, Warrant Officer Akiyoshi Endo, whose place Ugaki had taken, climbed into the same space, refusing to be left behind. The aircraft took off with 3 men aboard. 10 additional aircraft accompanied them as escorts. They flew south toward Okinawa, toward the American fleet, toward a target that no longer mattered because the war was already over. None of the aircraft returned. Ugaki's body was never recovered. His last mission achieved nothing except to add 11 more names to the list of Japanese killed in a war that had been lost long before they died. The truth that Ugaki had finally understood but could never accept was this. Japan had lost the war in American shipyards. Every calculation about decisive battles and 6-month windows had been rendered meaningless by a simple industrial reality. The Americans could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them. They could produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The Essex-Class carrier program alone illustrated the disparity. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards completed 17 Essex-Class carriers that saw combat in World War II. 7 more were completed after the war ended. 24 carriers total from a single class. Japan completed 0 new fleet carriers during the war. Every carrier Japan deployed in 1944 and 1945 had been laid down before Pearl Harbor. The construction times told the story. USS Essex, 20 months. USS Yorktown, 16.5 months. USS Franklin, 14 months. These were not rushed jobs producing inferior ships. These were magnificent carriers that would serve through the Korean War, through the Vietnam War, with some remaining in service until 1991. The last Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, was not retired until 1991, 50 years after her keel was laid. Japan could not comprehend this industrial capability because Japan possessed nothing comparable. Japanese shipyards worked meticulously, carefully, producing ships of exquisite quality, but they could not produce them quickly. And, in industrial warfare, quantity had its own quality. 24 Essex-Class carriers, even if individually inferior to Japanese designs, which they were not, would defeat 9 Japanese carriers through sheer numerical superiority. But the real lesson went deeper than simple numbers. The Americans had built a system for training pilots, a system for maintaining aircraft, a system for sustaining carrier operations at sea for months, a system for repairing battle damage, a system for replacing losses, a system for learning from experience and continuously improving tactics, and most critically, a system for producing all the material necessary to support carrier warfare at a rate that overwhelmed any opponent. Japan had no such system. Japan had individual excellence. Japan had brave pilots and skilled engineers and dedicated sailors, but individual excellence could not defeat systematic superiority. Courage could not defeat logistics. Fighting spirit could not defeat industrial production. Admiral Ugaki had calculated everything except what mattered most. He had calculated ship speeds and gun ranges and aircraft performance, but he had not calculated the true measure of American industrial capacity. He had not understood that American factories could mass-produce precision. He had not recognized that American shipyards could compress 24 months of work into 14 months. He had not grasped that American training programs could produce competent pilots faster than combat could eliminate them. The 6-month window that Japanese planning had depended upon was a mathematical fiction. It had assumed American production would be slow. It had assumed American resolve would be weak. It had assumed that tactical superiority would compensate for industrial inferiority. Every assumption was wrong. The war had been lost before it began because the numbers never added up. They only appeared to add up to planners who did not understand the true scale of American industrial power. Ugaki's diary survived the war. It was recovered and eventually published, providing historians with one of the most valuable Japanese accounts of the Pacific War. His observations were remarkably honest. He did not blame defeat on insufficient fighting spirit, or bad luck, or divine will. He blamed it on mathematics, on production rates, on systems, on the simple material reality that Japan could not build ships and train pilots fast enough to compete with American industry. The final irony is that Ugaki had been right to worry in 1941. He had argued for caution. He had warned that a prolonged war with America would be unwinnable, but his warnings had been overruled by officers who believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They had calculated that 6 months would be sufficient. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Essex-Class carriers were the physical manifestation of that miscalculation. 24 ships, each one, carrying 90 aircraft, each one representing an industrial capability that Japan could not match. They were not the only factor in American victory, but they were a decisive factor. They provided the platform for American air superiority. They enabled the island-hopping campaign. They brought the war to Japan's home waters, and they did so in numbers that made victory inevitable. In the end, Ugaki understood that courage alone was never enough. Individual excellence was never enough. Tactical brilliance was never enough. Wars between industrial powers were won by the side that could produce more, train more, sustain more. The side with better systems would always defeat the side with better slogans. And in the Pacific War, America's shipyards had written the verdict long before the final battle was fought. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.